Here, I'll start.
Are we good?
Good morning and welcome everyone to our first policy and personnel committee meeting for the school year. What's customary at this point in the starting of the new school year is to nominate a committee chair. Are there any nominations from the committee members?
We don't.
Okay. Any other nominations? All right. Is there a second on that nomination?
Second nomination?
All right. If everyone's comfortable with that, do you accept the nomination on the chair?
Thank you.
Good. All right. So we have an agenda before us today. Do you want to take the lead, or would you like me to go through the steps?
Well, I think that I'm happy to take over, but I actually think the first couple things are really yours that you're briefing us on as well
Okay.
anyway. So
Very good.
what we have on our list next is approving the calendar dates. For anybody watching, the agenda is always on Board Docs. There's a link under the calendar on this date, so you can always find it in advance.
Very good. So what the committee has is a list of the dates for the school year. And those are there, and we put those on the district calendar, and we'll be following that calendar unless there's any changes along the way. And of course, if there are, we would let the community know that as well. All right, so those dates seem acceptable to the committee?
Those look great. Next on the agenda, I have the minutes. I don't think we have to formally approve them, we just know we have them.
Correct.
And the committee will take a look at them.
Yeah, so they're there for you as a reference point today. If you want to have any feedback for them on them, please let me know. And then Javi and I can make some edits to them. Not hearing any edits to them, we'll put them on the next school board agenda and have them approved.
Great. Thank you.
So personnel update. Those who've been engaged in the opening of schools, we've had a very busy last few months in making sure we're properly staffed for the opening of school. For example, we hired 6 new administrators, we hired 30 new teachers. We've been hiring several secretaries, paraprofessionals, custodians, and maintenance staff members. It's been a very busy few months. Overall, we're in a very good place right now for staffing of the schools. You'll see on the upcoming board agenda, there's even more approvals for you than you had some already in the last board agenda as well. So I think if I were to highlight something that was a bit a special event for us this past year, couple of months, was we had our new teacher orientation for 30 teachers. We had a new administrator orientation as well, which is a new program that we put in place this year, trying to help those administrators acclimate even better. So those were just 2 highlights that I thought the committee would be interested in.
Thank you, Dr. Shields. I know that there was a lot this summer, right? Do you have the numbers for the clerical and custodial too, or the overall number?
I don't have exact numbers.
That's
That's okay. That's fine. I don't have exact numbers on that, but we've hired a number of secretaries. I think we've hired about 8 or 9 secretaries over the summer. And the educational assistants and the teaching assistants in the ongoing process. I don't have exact numbers on that, but we continue to hire. For example, I'm interviewing 2 paraprofessionals later today.
But I know in the last months and really a couple of years of your tenure, we've gone through a lot of hiring. I think sometimes when the community hears we've hired X number of hires, what they hear is dollar signs. But what they should be hearing is that we're being really efficient about staffing the school up the way that it needs to be staffed. These aren't new positions for the most part.
For the most part.
It's filling positions because then we can provide the programs that we need to provide.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So thank you for all that work.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Can I just backtrack? You mentioned an orientation for the new administration. That's separate and apart from the
Teacher orientation?
no, the retreat.
Yeah, that was.
So, okay,
It is separate.
okay,
Yeah.
Okay.
So Dr. Hines hosts a retreat for all administrators across the entire district, which was a very meaningful experience for us this year. What we did is we Also carved out a half-day experience focusing on very specific skills that we think all administrators should have. Things around like purchasing. And Kathy O'Hara came and spoke at that gathering and walked administrators through the codes and the process behind purchasing and setting up the new budget for the next year. Another topic that we talked about was the observation process. All administrators, for the most part, are involved in the observation process. So what does it look like in Fort Washington? And how are they expected to deliver on that? So it's more nuts and bolts and skill sets.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
That sounds great though, and important. The nuts and bolts are important, especially if we want our administrators to be on the same page.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
Great, love it.
Very good. So the next item on the agenda is the tenure review process timeline. This is something that we approve at the beginning of each school year. Since this committee also receives the recommendations for tenure later in the school year, this is providing to you the timeline for how that process unfolds here in Fort Washington. And then what I do after you accept it here is I then have it forwarded to all administrators in the district so they're aware when deadlines have to be met and when recommendations are being made to the Policy and Personnel Committee on recommendations for tenure in the spring.
Would the committee be correct in assuming that this timeline matches what's happened in the past?
Yes.
There's nothing new or different here.
Correct. We update the dates and we find that spacing it out this way gives everyone ample time to be thorough in making that recommendation and also giving the board time to give feedback if there's any on that process.
Okay. I'm assuming also that if you thought this needed to change at all at some point, you'll just let us know.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Can I ask you a quick question about these?
Mhm.
Yeah.
How many teachers or how many total staff get tenure in a year? So how many packets are reviewed?
So each year is unique into its own because people that are getting tenure have either been on a 3-year probationary period of time or a 4-year probationary period of time. And that is dependent on whether they've had tenure in a previous school district here in New York State. So from a rough number sense, we have this year approximately 30 employees that are being considered for tenure.
Okay.
So those are certificated staff members that are either administrators, teachers, or teaching assistants that are eligible for tenure in this year.
Is that, am I remembering correctly, is that number a lot higher than it was last year? I thought we had a very slim group this past year.
I think it's fairly similar. I think we were in the 20s this past
Okay.
year. This year, it is a significant number though.
Yeah, we have quite a few administrators this year though.
Okay.
Yes, I think that's part of what's a little bit different than years past.
Yeah, we have approximately 6 administrators this year.
And then I have a follow-up question, which you don't have to answer now, but I would love to hear about how many staff that were eligible for tenure that were not recommended over the last 10 to 15 years, like the general sense.
Okay.
My guess is that there's not a ton, but just to get an ebb and a flow of this.
Of course, yeah.
That'd be great. Thank you.
If I can add a question to Adam's question, Dr. Block's question, sorry. Which I think is a valid question. I think though I'm under the impression that a good administrator above will be sort of trying to counsel someone who isn't up for tenure. We hopefully don't get to the point where we say, no, sorry, you didn't get it, right? They're already looking for another job before that. Is there any way to capture that number or anecdotally share that number, which I think would give Dr. Block a little bit more of the information he's looking for too?
Yeah, I think I understand what you're looking for. So it's a 3 or 4 year process. We hope that we're not getting to year 3 or 4 of that process in making that decision.
Right.
So conversations are held early on about areas that we need to see significant improvement in if there's a deficiency. And then we give a window of time for where we expect that person to meet that improvement. And if they're unsuccessful, then it's normally within 12 months to 18 months that we advise them that this is probably not going to be working out.
Okay.
I don't know if it's possible to anecdotally share what you think that number would look like, because I think what Dr. Block is trying to get at is, are is there data to show that we as a school district are making discerning decisions about tenure, or is it that once you're in, you're good, and then 3 or 4 years later you get tenure? I think that's what you're getting at.
That you know me very well now.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's, I'm not gonna give you exact numbers, but
No,
let me
I know.
speak in general terms. There are a couple of people each year that we are looking very closely at because we have concerns and we are expecting improvement. And we tell them exactly what we're looking for, and if they can meet those benchmarks, then we're in a better place. But sometimes they can't meet them. And we then have a conversation with them and say, hey, this isn't probably gonna be working out for you. And it's not a great fit, and we suggest you move on. And that happens very naturally each year. Not that they're not hard conversations,
Right.
but I would say that there's a couple of people each year that we have that conversation with, and you'll see them on the board agenda as just a resignation.
Right. So then is the number that we're looking for more number of people that leave before 3 years or 3 or 4 years? Or number, would that be a better sense of getting how many, right? Because nobody's perfect in their hiring, right? We all want to be, but nobody's perfect in their hiring. And so maybe that's a better number, like a count of how many people left within, 3 years or 4 years of being hired. And not, obviously, lots of people leave for lots of reasons, so there could be lots of reasons for that, but maybe that's like the bigger bucket.
Yeah, I can certainly have that number for you.
Okay. That would be.
How many people leave within their first 3 or 4 years of hire date?
Sure, that would be great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure.
I have one other question on the timeline. Do you have anything? No, plenty, I don't want to jump ahead of you. In terms of the list of the people who will be reviewed this year, the board gets that for the first time in February, right?
No,
Or do we get the list earlier?
You're actually gonna see that on the board agenda that you're gonna see for Tuesday's board meeting.
Fabulous.
Yep, that's under the informational section, just a list of all the employees that are up for tenure at the
Now
end of
that
this
you
year.
say that, I remember this, that's great. Okay. Any other questions on this?
I'm sorry to always be late to the process a little too slowly sometimes. So
You're not like,
Part
you're
of-
a critical thinker.
maybe if you're looking for even more detail, those kinds of questions about tenure could be addressed in an executive session where there's more privacy for our staff. Is that what you're looking for, more detail?
I'm not looking for an individual, it's more like these are process questions, right?
Okay.
And general numbers, I don't want to, I certainly have no individual in mind that I'm thinking about. It's more like, in general, if we are awarding tenure, let's call it 100% of the time, then you're like, do we really hire at the outset in our interview process for the last 10 years, 100% of teachers that should be staying with us? And it's thinking critically about that.
Makes sense.
Sure.
And there is a process in place too, like if we see that a teacher or an administrator is struggling, there's a plan that we can put them on. So whether it's a teacher improvement plan, an administrator improvement plan. So we provide a lot of different supports over time, and if they, again, as Dr. Shields was saying, if they're still not meeting the criteria that we can set out, then they leave. And it does come in the form of resignation, because it's in their best interest, to resign.
Yes.
So.
Do you have a sense of how many of those we're talking about every year?
So less than a handful, I would say. And I think to your point, Dr. Black, it's definitely not 100%, so if there's a cohort that we're hiring, and again, I'm hyper generalizing, but it's probably, it's probably less than 10% over time, either through attrition or they just move on, or we don't ask them to come back. But there's a lot of different things that we put in place before. So we work with both unions, or all the unions really, as far as their leadership is concerned. But you're right, we never, and we try to hit 100%, but it just doesn't happen, unfortunately. So.
Thank you.
All right, so the next item on the agenda is the code of conduct. Members of the committee had asked that I at least establish a timeline that we hope is deliverable this school year. So as you're aware, the code of conduct is going to be reviewed by one of our diversity, equity, and inclusion committees this year. So I met with Dr. Pernick, who is helping facilitate those committees. And the timeline that he has helped us establish is that we're going to, our goal is to have a draft to you by May, but we're also going to give you an update this October on how that process is moving. All right, so he has established committees. One of the committees is dedicated to the code of conduct. And he realizes that this committee is looking to have a draft by May. And he thinks for now, that's realistic.
How was that committee decided upon? What was the process? Who participated? I don't need specific names necessarily, but what was the makeup and how did that come about?
Yes, Dr. Hines and the central office cabinet have been working closely with him. It's made up of administrators and teachers, I believe. And they worked with the union heads of both of those two groups to have a nice cross-section of all three levels, so they could look critically at the code of conduct in a way that is going to be better in meeting the needs of kids at all three levels.
Yeah, and to go back to the retreat that we had over the summer, it was one of the focal points that we discussed, and we broke down into multiple groups. One group was dedicated to just begin the conversation of what it would look like as far as us looking to potentially review the code of conduct. So, and actually at the all administrator meeting tomorrow, we'll continue that conversation. We're not actually changing anything, it's just we're collecting our thoughts and feelings about the current one and some of the changes that we'd like to see at the time. So we started that process already.
So for the October meeting, when we're gonna get an update on this, if there's a bunch of committee meetings that are happening between, I guess, September and May, I think it would be great to have if not an agenda, a subject, like a time that that committee is meeting, like a date, and then the topics of the meeting. So we see like what they're planning on doing, and then in May, hopefully that's been done.
I mean, this is really not the policy committee per se, but since we're discussing it, I'm wondering if there's any plan for input from the parent community on the code of conduct as well. Because it sounds like it's teachers and administrators only, it's not other staff, and it's not community members.
Right. I mean, I think Dr. Hines, I think that's an important part of the process eventually.
Yes. I think right now we're in the embryonic stages right now. So at some point, yeah, definitely. And not just parents, but I think, said Rachel, even the student perspective as well, for sure. So right now we're setting the stage, and then we'll start inviting people later on in the process.
And after the code of conduct is hopefully, draft form May finalized at some point, is then there a process where it trickles down to the various schools or impacts school level policies at the various schools?
It would need to. So I think we're talking big picture first,
Yeah.
and then we're gonna focus in on the different schools to make sure that we're able to deliver that at each of the levels.
That's fine.
Yeah, and as Chris said, has a nice cross section of all different levels, which is really important as far as different perspectives are concerned. And I think one of the major things we're focusing on too is restorative practices embedded within the code of conduct too. So that was a major thing that we were discussing at least initially over the retreat. I know that was important to the board too.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think that's great. Restorative practices and restorative justice and making things educational opportunities when we can. Is something the board has been talking about for 4 or 5 years at this point, and I think it's great. And it also, to me, ties into one of Dr. Block's and the rest of the board's favorite topics, consistency too, because I think we have schools that are effectively using restorative processes already. We're just not using that word, and it's just not an across the board approach to how we treat student discipline.
I remember that there was conversations about referrals, for example, and how they were being applied or used, and data collection, and whether or not we wanted data collection, particularly at the elementary level.
Yeah.
So is looking at referrals like actual forms and what we're looking to keep track of?
The whole thing.
The whole,
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely, the whole thing. You bring up some good points. We have learned a lot over the past year and a half, 2 years, not only the number of referrals who have, what groups of students have been over-referred, let's just say, but even the referral process and the form itself. We're looking at everything from soup to nuts.
Very good.
Thank you.
So we've invited Kathy O'Hara, for those out in the audience, our Assistant Superintendent for Business, to bring back some feedback to us on a few policies that we did start a conversation on last year. So this is like continuing that conversation.
Thank you.
Yes, so this is actually, it's policy 6700R, and there's probably three different policies with that regarding the purchasing policy. So the 6700E, the one change we have looked at was separating the 2,000 to less than 5,000, where it would require 3 verbal quotes. And then 5,000 to 20,000 would be 3 written quotes. That was really something to just make sure that people purchasing things with a smaller value were actually
So,
making the best out of it. That's
Ms.
basically-
O'Hara, just literally number 3. Got it.
Actually, no, it's 6E1, 6700E1. It's just one fee.
Oh, got it. Okay.
Figured I'd take
This
the
is
simple
maybe the
ones
longest
first.
policy ever.
So I think yours are highlighted, they're bolded. Where it says less than 5,000, that's what would be proposed to be added to it. So it's really just making sure that people are getting quotes for 2,000 to 5,000, that's just verbal. It wouldn't really have to be a written quote. 5,000 to 19,999 would be 3 written quotes. It just would make the process a little bit easier.
So before that, that number was 10,000, did you say?
It was actually 2,000 to less than 20,000. We had to
Oh, got it,
receive
got it.
written quotes, right? So for something that was very small, we had to get a written quote, it's not always, that easy to get a written quote from someone.
I
That's
mean,
one quote.
I feel like just based on practical knowledge, anybody who's ever had to get a quote for any sort of work on their home probably understands why you want to change this.
Right, yes, yeah, just to make it easier to actually, and a lot of the purchasing that the district does is off of contracts or bids. So, this is really just in case it's something like
And these are all still subject to the same, I'm saying this mostly for the community, the same like checks that every other purchase would be subject to, right? At a certain number, the superintendent has to approve, at a certain number, you have to approve, at a certain number, the board has to approve. And obviously it all has to be voted on by the taxpayer, so it's really just an efficiency.
Yes, and it's all audited by the district's internal claims auditor. It goes through quite a rigorous scanning by people. The 6700R policy, this is the one where we had kind of questions more. And I believe you had some questions about one of the. No, you look. I think it was a little confusing, so what I did is I actually, if you look at 24, contracts for services, you'll notice that that's all bolded. And there was question between 1 and 2, I believe, what the difference was. So with 2, I actually added that are equal to or greater than 10,000 there. But the bigger question here was, I was requesting that the board allow the superintendent or the purchasing agent to approve contracts for services up to $10,000, like $10,000 or below. And then we would be informing the Board of Education that we entered into these contracts. And that was really to give the district the ability to approve contracts for, if someone was going to be like a Sept director, that might only be $1,000 contract. Currently, we would have to wait for the board to approve it, the board president would sign off on it. This would just be that we could process things faster, smaller things.
I thought that the number was just lower currently. The board currently has to approve every single contract?
Every single contract, so
Okay,
if it's a
I thought it was just
contract for, so in the past, you might have some of these contracts, you wouldn't have had a contract, you would have just had a purchase order. And it would say you're going to provide this for $500. But when I came to the district, I said we really need a contract for these things. So it was kind of tying up the process a little bit where it could have gotten through faster. I wanted a contract that laid out the details of what was being provided. So one of the questions that I think Ms. Brooks had, the question was, what are other school districts around here doing? Do they also have this? So I did poll 10 of my colleagues from surrounding districts. None of them actually allow the superintendent or purchasing agent to do that. So I just want to be open about that. This is something that my former district, I think it's more common out in Suffolk, where we would do that. We would have fewer Board of Education meetings and you can always get things on the board in a timely fashion. That was really my rationale for getting this, proposing it anyway.
Okay.
I think the important piece of that is that it's still coming to the board
Yes,
in its entirety, but it has been recently approved.
right. And everything in this proposal for the policy is very specific and says how this has to be awarded according to our purchasing policies and all of the different guidelines. So it is very specific and very thorough. So it's not, we don't want to not have the board providing oversight into the contracts. You still want to be seeing them. And if there were any questions, you would of course be able to ask questions, but they would be scrutinized very closely before being approved.
Is there any, before we get into any comments on it, is there any other, actually I should step back, for the public, obviously, we're stepping, the policy committee tends to run a little bit differently than some of the other committees. All the timelines of the committees are different, but for us, it's really a rolling agenda all the time because we're constantly looking at policies and then putting them on for first reading and approving them, editing them along the way. This one happens to be huge and we're coming back to it after June last year. So I think we should discuss today, if the committee is on board for this, definitely hear anything that Mrs. O'Hara has to say so we don't have to make you come back.
Sure, I don't mind doing that.
And then maybe if we could get like a red line version of this to show what changes have been made overall over time. And I think the committee probably wants to go back and look at previous discussion on it and make sure we're incorporating anything. So I'm suggesting we not put this on for first read today. Discuss it because it's in front of us, but make sure we've captured everything from last year too before we send it to the board meeting. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes, but I think if I'm following you correctly, you're highlighting the work that we did last year that got us to this moment, right?
Yes, yeah.
These are the
It was one exception because the question you had
Oh, thank you for reminding me.
specifically had, was there was confusion between 1 and 2, I believe, what the difference was.
Number 20, and number 20.
In number 24,
Mhm.
section 1 and 2. And previously in section 2, the words that are equal to or greater than were not part of it. So that's why I think it was confusing because it actually would seem
Oh,
like the
that's
same
right, I
thing.
remember that now.
Yes.
Yes, they seem to cross over or something,
Yes.
yeah.
And I think it was just typing it and document.
It wasn't clear that it was 10,000 and up.
Right.
Number two.
Exactly.
So since this is the hot topic of it, should we jump right in? If the board has any comments on this,
I want to say, I'm going to ask a process question on this, which is, this seems to have budgetary implications. So obviously it's a policy because it's sitting here in the policy manual, but this is one of the policies that I think has a big budgetary implication. And so what is the role of the budget committee in also reviewing this and blessing it going forward?
I mean, I think that we sort of figure this out as we go, because it's pretty common that two committees would,
First jurisdiction.
yeah, exactly, the two committees would both have an interest in something. To my mind, the more important part, is that really the entire board should discuss this, right? I think it has to be a board decision to make such a big change, but I think we could start by discussing it here, unless the committee thinks that we should, kick it to an evening board meeting, which we certainly could. I mean, I think we can put a policy on the agenda that's not for first read, it's just for discussion, so.
You could, I just want to help the board move it along in the sense that if you want the policy committee to do work on it, I think that's one avenue. But I think if the budget committee wants to look at it, they could as well. But I don't want it to be slowed down. I know how you like to move things along. They don't need to take more time than necessary. But we want everyone to feel comfortable with it.
Yeah, I mean, my gut is that there's no reason to send it to another committee, right? Because there are a lot of policies on the policy agenda that have budget implications or have curriculum implications. And I think we can have a discussion here and then still be cognizant of the fact that we want the whole board to comment on it. And a better way to reach the whole board is to go to an evening board meeting, even if at that point we're putting it on for first reading, right? It
Sure.
can still be a discussion and we can still decide to edit it in that evening meeting or change our mind on how we want it to be, or we can send it back to the committee. That's at that point. So I guess my preference would be not to send it through multiple committees because I think it slows things down.
I think the first read is what we have traditionally provided for in terms of the rest of the board's input, right? So
Sure.
this would be following that same process.
It would exactly.
And really, what I said about how the board can discuss, what we've done traditionally, you're right, is that some of the policies have gone to the full board and we know full well that we're calling it first read, but it's a robust discussion that the board's gonna have about what they wanna do. So with that though, I'm opening it up to the committee. What did the two of you think about this? Should we talk about this for a few minutes, because it's a big change.
I guess for me, what your description of that our surrounding areas have not made this kind of a change, have they made what I think is a really powerful piece of this is your description of the fact that we had often not had contracts for small amounts of money. So that's a way of protecting the district and making sure that the service that we have paid for, we are receiving, right?
Yes, or that we agree to.
So
Because
those,
that's what the contract seeks to do. A purchase order is a type of contract, but usually it's not very specific. So the purchase order tells the vendor, we promise to pay for this if you provide this, but that's typically an item like a book or, okay.
so when you compared us to the other districts, did they even have that step of a formal contract, or they were still on the purchase order side of things?
That I honestly don't know. I sent out a question asking it, and a lot of their purchasing policies are silent to this. It doesn't say specifically, but if it's silent, that means everything has to go to the Board of Education, because they're really the only one who can contractually obligate the district. So
I'm just wondering if we're making two significant changes. And it sounds like we don't know the comparison in terms of the contract piece. We know the comparison of the allowing the superintendent to make these purchases, and then we
see them after the fact.
Right, but see, this is making sure we have contracts for smaller things, is actually protecting the district more. So as far as the other districts go, I hope they do it, but I wouldn't want to say they don't do it, so we shouldn't do it.
No,
But,
okay,
And that change, really what you're saying is it's already been
It's more
made.
protected, yes.
And then this became for you the outcropping of that change.
Right,
Right.
because it wasn't in your policy, and this is something that at my former district, we did have in policy. So it just allowed us to more efficiently get things through the end. And the reason we picked 10,000 is because that's what has to go to the board for a budget transfer. So if you're thinking 10,000 is too high, would you could always do 5,000 if you think the 10,000 is too high. It really depends on your feelings about it.
I'm conflicted on this one, because I think it's unreasonable that the superintendent does not have the ability to write a check for $50 without board approval. And so I think that, but I tend to think that 10,000 is a relatively big number for our district. So that's sort of where I don't have a fully formed opinion on where to be, but I think 0 is too low. I think we need to give, Dr. Hines has a lot of discretion, and he should be able to use that discretion, and that includes making financial decisions. But 10,000 may be, on the upper limit of that, so we may want to think about a number and then revisit it. It'll be going well after a year, and then we can always increase it.
Sure.
So, Kathy, I listened to Kathy's explanation as far as the rationale. I mean, what's the upside to all this? Right? And for what it's worth, in my previous district, it was $5,000. And that seemed to work very well. And before I left, we were going to revisit that particular number and see if they would upgrade it to 7,500 or 10,000. So I don't think that's a reasonable potential place to start, and then, we can assess and see how that, for what that's.
For my part, I tend to agree with Dr. Block, right? 0 makes no sense, right? It should be something, but 10,000 feels like a very high number, especially when one of the board's primary responsibilities is financial oversight. $10,000 plus 10,000 plus 10,000, very easily you could get to a very high number where it looks like maybe the board hasn't actually had oversight. I'm wondering if we asked for an opinion from council on any of this and how it connects to the board's financial oversight role. Have we?
We could,
Can we do that? But I guess my opinion would be I would be open to a lower number that helps efficiency, doesn't get in the way of business practices, but we do have very frequent board meetings and we are able to approve stuff. We can always add an extra one just for the purpose of voting on stuff, although obviously that's not very efficient. That's kind of where I am. I guess procedurally, Dr. Shields and the rest of the committee, tell me what you think, but I'm thinking we have our opinions out there. We don't actually need to beat this down to a number right now. Maybe if Ms. O'Hara will speak to council and find out how this connects to the board's oversight role and whether or not there's any legal implication here. And I think the committee should really look over the rest of the draft. If you could provide us one with redlining that shows the various edits that have been made so that we feel like everything's been done and incorporated from previous conversations. And then we go from there. And I don't know, since I'm jumping in the middle of this discussion really, since I wasn't on this committee last year, whether or not you think that this could be put on for first read. Actually, sorry, I'm thinking out loud here. So we had the full public discussion of this. I could take a look back at the video, look over the redlining, make sure everything's incorporated, and we can put that version on for first reading at the next meeting. Because those discussions already we're having public, we don't have to have conversations again.
Correct, you don't need to have another conversation here if you don't want it brought back to committee, and then, but I think we need some clarity on what the number is
Right.
for Kathy.
I would suggest the 5,000 if you all are good with that. It does say in here that the board would be notified as soon as possible. So we could have that here updated in your weekly packets, that these were contracts that were approved, they would be below 5,000.
Do you have a sense of what buckets in terms of numbers contracts fall into? You know, like how many contracts are we talking about that are under 5,000? How many are we talking about that are under 10? How many are we talking about that are under 1,000? Which
Yeah,
honestly is more where I would tend as a start.
that would take a while to find all that information, because we have like a big contract.
I think it would be a waste of your time, and anecdotally, I don't think you need to go count across.
It's a fair amount, and sometimes when they're so small, like if there's a board meeting, we have to have it a week before the board. And then it could be, so it could be 3 weeks, and it could be something we really would like to get implemented sooner.
Right.
And it's a small amount of money, so that's where, like, that's the experience I've seen here. And I know with, at the building level, there's issue where they may have a speaker they want to come in, or a staff developer to come in, and it only costs like $2,000 or $1,000. You know, so it's kind of, they want them to come in like a week or 2, but it takes us like a month to get it approved, you know, so this would just be more timely. And it would be one of it, like in a weekly packet. And at the next board meeting, it could be a whole list of where it is in the public speaking.
So it sounds like from a step standpoint, what we should be doing next is, you're gonna change the number to 5,000 and confirm with, Howard Miller to make sure that the 5,000 is an okay threshold.
Yes.
So maybe we just need to bring it back to committee here
Okay,
for the next conversation. I don't know if the rest of the committee has input on the number. I would rather have the number be lower than that. It sounds like 1,000 or 2,500. I'm also uncomfortable with the fact that none of our surrounding districts do it, and also uncomfortable with numbers that simple math can make into huge numbers that we're not looking at. But I think the most important part is we're bringing it back to committee. Actually, maybe we don't need to decide on a number today, and we get the input from Howard and have the discussion from there.
So, I'll say between 2,500 and 5,000.
Yeah.
When I talk to him, I could just say,
I would ask him.
the amount.
I would ask him if there's any number threshold. I'm assuming, since legal advice is usually gray, not black and white, there's gonna be some number with which he is uncomfortable, right? So it might be helpful.
Right, well, that number would be anything for a public works contract where it's 35,000 or above, where it's in general municipal law that you need to go out for a formal bid. There's an ad in the paper.
So maybe we bring it back and see what Howard says.
Am I correct? I just wanted to clarify for Rachel. I think the red lines you're talking about, are those the bold?
yep.
Everything that's
you have
bold.
Oh, everything
both
is
edits are
bolded.
bold.
Yes.
That would say we could help see what's costed.
But the last conversation so the 6,700R says revised March 2nd. The last conversation, I'm gonna ask Ms. Brooks, because I see, yeah, it wasn't, right,
That was
I think this is the draft proposed revised date.
Yeah.
And, this makes me think that there may be some additional edits that weren't incorporated yet, because I think the last time this was discussed was not March. They were not, okay. Ms. Brooks is saying it's not, thank you. Ms. Brooks is the former committee chair. Okay, so, Since we're bringing it back anyway, the rest of the committee can look at it in greater detail if we have anything else to add. Dr. Shields, is there anything else in here that are the hot topics of this policy that you think we should highlight before we move on?
I don't believe so. Is there anything else? No, okay, good. Thanks very much.
Thank you for commenting.
I'll leave that up to you.
Run.
Deb, I was
Yeah,
going
Ms.
to wait
Brooks.
until you were calling on community comments, but if Ms. O'Hara is leaving, can I ask my
You
questions
know what?
now?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And for the
I didn't
public,
want
Ms.
it-
Brooks is the former chair of policy committee last year, so we definitely do want your input. Go
I
ahead.
wanted to be respectful of the committee,
No,
but
no,
we're
no,
going
go
to
ahead.
lose our star witness.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I just wanted everybody to know, Ms. O'Hara, we never formally finished reviewing this policy last year. It was supposed to come back, I think in June, Ms. O'Hara was not able to attend the meeting, and then we just held it over to now, so it wasn't revised at all. And it was basically reviewed as is, so that review, that thing that says revised at the end really should say reviewed. Nothing was changed, just to clarify. And I appreciate the fact you cleaned up the language in paragraph 24, thank you. So my first question is, when we're talking about in paragraph 3, the purchase of goods and services in an amount of less than 2,000, nothing required, it had always been that way.
Correct.
Right, so that's not a change, I just wanted to clarify that, okay. So now when we get to paragraph 24, 24 is only for contracts for services. So can you give us an example of, in the past, what contracts for services we would have allowed the superintendent, whoever it may have been in the past, or in the future, what types of contracts have we seen already that Dr. Hines would have been able to approve before it got to the board to approve? Can you think of anything?
Trying to think.
If not, I don't mean to put you on the hot seat, but just see if the board and the community understand of what we're talking about.
Right,
It's only
so
for
it-
specific services.
It could be someone doing professional development, that would be one thing. It could be for, usually occupational therapy comes off of a bid, but it could be, if it was a specific instance with a student where they only required once a month or something, that could be $2,500 or $5,000, it could be very small.
Could there have been something with NYU Metro, if it hadn't been 20,000, is that considered a service? For example, because I know that's a contract that is
Yes,
kind of bouncing back and forth in board discussions.
right, but that's like 28,000, I think.
But had it been 10, is that something that could have been approved by the superintendent without the board first approving it?
Yes.
Okay. I don't mean to put you on the witness stand, but this is just how I tend to ask questions. Okay, so when you ask the surrounding districts, what they do, in Nassau, I guess it's not common here. Did any of the business officials ask you why it had been done in Suffolk, or did they question
Well,
it?
actually,
seem concerned, or did they say, hey, that's a great idea, why aren't we doing that?
no, I actually said to them, do any of you permit your superintendent or purchasing agent to approve contracts under 10,000? So I didn't say, what's your process? I just said, so they said yes or no.
And then there's nothing. So it's not just the superintendent, it's also the purchasing agent?
Yeah, it could be.
Is that in
I
here?
believe we just say
Oh, would
superintendent.
delegation would include the purchasing agent, I see. So it's not just the superintendent, it's also an employee of the district, a designated employee of the specific
Right, the
designated.
purchasing agent is appointed by the Board of Education to
Okay, all right. So what happens if the superintendent approves a contract? Excuse me, and the board doesn't agree? Whether it's this board or some future board, because this policy, even though it gets legally reviewed annually, which is why we're looking at it now, but what happens if some future board says, or even this board says, no, we don't really like the fact that a purchasing agent or Dr. Hines or whomever approved this contract? What recourse does the board have? Because the horse is already out of the barn, right? We've already obligated ourselves.
Right, similar to a purchase order, being placed for 20 Chromebooks or something, you know, like that you've authorized the purchasing agent to follow the district's purchasing policy. So hopefully we don't have the instance where, but yes, you would be obligated to it.
So procedurally, so for example, when we did the one-to-one initiative, or let's go back to something even smaller. When the IT department purchases Chromebooks, you're saying that they've already purchased the Chromebooks, they already have a purchase order for the Chromebooks, and the board is approving that after the fact?
The boards, they're approving the payment of it, but it's already been, by issuing a purchase order, that obligates the district to pay for that. So you would be reviewing the actual payment, but once your purchasing agent obligates the district is obligated to pay for that and receive it. Yeah. And that's why you appoint a purchasing agent, because they're fully aware of what the purchasing policy that you set forward is, and they're trained in purchasing and they understand the goals of the Board of Education, so.
So this is like a purchasing agent purchasing goods, but this is now for services, this particular. Thank you.
So piggybacking on what Ms. Brooks just said, which I have been sort of thinking about and trying to remember, I think that we do occasionally have these contracts come to us where they're already signed, but the board vote is necessary for the approval. So I'm wondering if for all intents and purposes, this kind of happens that way already, right?
Well, I think what you might be referring to is for like OT-PT services for special needs students. There may be something according to their IEP that needs to be put in place. So it may have to be effective September 1st, but it might not come to you until October. So yes, in that term, it is procedural, but the IEP drives what we would be obligated to pay for that. It's because the IEP drives what services the student.
So you're thinking this will more, not to put words in your mouth, but it more impacts the things that are optional, right? Where a building or the superintendent is trying to do something new and different and wants to, like you said, hire a speaker or do something like that. And this would speed up the process.
Right.
And since you're here, and Ms. Brooks did point out that you're still here, does the committee mind if we ask if the public has any questions on this? The public.
Yeah, I just want to say that the board has full discretion to approve $1 or $1 million. So if you want to give the superintendent the power to purchase, as to spend money, $1 million, you can do it. And the question is whether it is financially and fiduciarily acceptable. I think that the controller has spoken about willful by neglect of fiduciary obligations. So I think the superintendent, of course, should have the ability to spend money and not having to go to the entire full board for every canvas of paper, box of paper. But maybe the board, to facilitate this transfer, this process, can assign the board president or somebody else that person has to be informed as a representative of the board, and that person immediately notifies the board as to whether they have to meet maybe emergency or not. But at least there is some accounting on the books that there is accountability or and doesn't tie the hands of the superintendent for everything. Now, if it was up to me, I would let Dr. Hines spend $25,000. He doesn't work very well.
So you're saying prior to Dr. Hines signing the contract, have him inform the board at the
President.
the executive, right? And they would give their approval prior to
I
him
mean,
signing.
the board decides who continues the block. Is it Gilliard or the board president? And then, and then there is that, this is what I'm doing. I have to do it by 6 tonight, whatever. Should be an email, but there has to be some evidentiary notes that the board has some look into it. It doesn't mean that, he cannot be constrained or any superintendent to do those type of contracts, of course. I don't know, but it's up to the board, whatever you guys want to, you have the power.
I think Dr. Prince has a comment.
I do. I just want to set the stage where I don't have an agenda where I have a bunch of purchase orders that are only $10,000 that I'm looking to spend. Yeah, so,
I thought we were going to Aruba.
It was 23, 24, George. Come on. So, because I hear some trepidation, and understandably so, I really do. There's a real, because you're right, Rachel, if there's a series of, let's say, 10 $5,000 purchases, that does get up very fast. But maybe as, George said, or we can come up with some internal structure where if it's over X amount of money, the board is apprised ahead of time, before that potential expenditure, before it's on the board, before we actually execute it in some way. So I totally get it. But I don't have like a plan to spend a lot of money anytime soon. I do, I just want to say.
Just to be clear, I don't think anybody here thinks you have that
I
plan
know,
either.
I know.
Though George would apparently let you do it.
Yeah.
But I think we have to remember, and definitely my questions are always couched this way, like when we're drafting policy, we're not drafting for the administration we have here.
Sure.
We're drafting
For the board.
or the board we have here, you're right. We're drafting for what's the general rules that we should have in place that protect the districts in the future. And so sitting here, we could all vote and say, well, you know what? We really trust Mr. O'Hara and Dr. Hines, and we know they're not gonna embezzle, and so we're good, right? We can have whatever number, but it's not for this circumstance. I mean, in Roslyn, we had a case not too long ago with serious financial misconduct that had implications for the whole community. It has implications for the legal duties of the board, and for the administrators. And so it's really not, it's not a, do we trust who's in place right now? It's, what do we think the right number here is that philosophically the board should be paying attention to?
I find it interesting though, much like civil service, very different philosophies in Nassau, Suffolk County, right? So where it is, it's like almost like a case study in some ways, but so it's a little more liberal, let's say, in Suffolk County. And again, it's something I am familiar with having up to a certain amount. But maybe, we give it a go as far as whatever that amount is. I know we're still gonna talk about it. I
guess
personally
we've had all the
think-
embezzlers in Nassau.
Yeah, I guess,
No,
the-
well, one of the issues too, which I noticed when I first started here, a lot of your contracts never had not to exceed.
that's right.
It would just be an open-ended contract. So the board was actually approving things for like OT where it was $100 an hour. But I said, well, let's make it not to exceed $6,000. Like, I wanted an estimate from the person doing it. Where before you could have approved a contract that could have gone up to 100,000 and not known. So I don't know if in here, we need to address it as well, that when a contract is done, it says not to exceed. Because if Dr. Hines signs something and it says not to exceed 3,000 or 5,000, if it did, or if he issued 3 contracts to the same vendor that were 5,000, that in aggregate would go over what you've authorized. So there's ways that you would be protected. You couldn't just do, or I shouldn't just pick.
Yeah, that's right. Or
You
just,
understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, a clever embezzler can work with whatever limit we set,
Anybody
not to
could
work.
do it. Yeah, no, well, it's true.
I know you're
We have
saying the
to look at
opposite,
it.
to the record.
I'm trying to put things in place that actually protect the district and future boards.
That's an interesting point. So where would you add, you think we should
Yeah,
add the not to
I
exceed
I
language?
have actually on all of the contracts, I've added not to exceed and they'll say 5,000. You know, and sometimes people say. well,
Is there language that we should add here for, God forbid, we don't have you anymore, and
That's what I'm just thinking as we were sitting here. I don't know that it doesn't say specifically, all contracts must have it not to exceed. And if we were going to exceed it, we would go to the board and say, on this contract, we would like to increase it to 35,000.
And you don't think that that would be a burden on your office? It doesn't happen that often.
In terms of exceeding the contract,
No,
not that I've seen last year.
because you're setting a limit that makes
Yeah.
sense.
It was, last year, it was a little challenging because people here weren't used to it. So they'd say, well, how can I estimate how much this OTP contract would be? And I said, well, look at the IUP, let's look at what could be the most you could need.
Mhm.
And if we're incorrect, then we go back and we adjust it. But at least the board knows that you're not committing to 100,000, it's only 10,000.
That makes sense. Thank you for doing that. I love life.
So that probably is something that should be addressed in here.
And do you,
so we're gonna bring this back then.
yeah, so this is a lengthy, so maybe we should all take a look and try and figure out where we would want to put this in there. Because it's a decent suggestion, unless Dr. Shields, you have it.
Well, I think Kathy can give us advice on where she wants to put that not to exceed language. I heard that we're gonna also go back to Mr. Miller and speak to him about the threshold number. And we'll bring back to this committee, if not October, November, those revisions for your consideration.
That sounds great.
And then how do we want to tell the rest of the board that they should be reviewing this?
That will probably, I think we said we're gonna make that a first read conversation, right?
But I think in the
Yeah, that's
meantime,
September.
Dr. Block is suggesting that we should just highlight it.
Has to come
I mean,
back
I
here.
can send an email to the rest of the board
So
that
that they just
says,
read it and say, this is coming, so nobody's blindsided at that point of the meeting.
absolutely. And that this is the topic, the hot topic. I can send an email. I mean, the board received this, but this is the important piece.
Yeah, so we'll bring it back to this committee either in October or November.
That's great.
And then, if all goes well, we'll then put it up for first read for the full board to have a discussion
That's
if they
great.
want to.
And I think if there's time in October and on the administrative end, you're ready to bring it back, kind of the sooner the better.
Yep.
Right, and get it done.
Should we also have language in there saying that if Dr. Hines informed the board president or vice president prior to signing the contract, that it would be please?
I mean, I tend to think that we have in there that they're supposed to, right, like the superintendent is supposed to inform the entire board, timely manner afterwards. I think that, I feel comfortable with that.
I agree with Dr. Black. And to me, I mean, it's an interesting creative suggestion, but I think it's very loose to put in a policy. And then it relies on that person then informing the rest of the board. I'd rather just have a straightforward conversation about what is the number that the board feels comfortable authorizing a superintendent to expend and go from there. Because if we trust the superintendent for that number, we trust the superintendent for that number, right?
And I'll try, I'll try and have examples of different things that would apply to this.
Okay. Thank you.
All right.
I think we're on to the next.
I think so. So the next item on the agenda is public participation in board meetings. This is another policy that has rolled over from previous agendas and has had extensive conversation around it. And thank you to Ms. Brooks, who did some editing of the policy in its latest form, which is what you have in front of you. So you see the bolds, I believe, are the most recent changes. What this is this is a merging of our previous policy, public participation at board meetings, with a NISBA sample policy. So what we did is we also took for the most part, took the language of the NISBA sample policy, made sure that our 2370 was incorporated into it, and renumbered it, because the philosophy of the committee was that we should use the numbers of policies that are prescribed by NISBA as we're upgrading our policies. So what you have in front of you is a policy for consideration that Ms. Brooks spent an extensive amount of time putting together. And since she's here, if there's
Yeah,
anything she'd like to
Ms.
say, it
Brooks,
might be
please jump
appropriate.
in.
Yeah.
So I'm really sorry to interrupt. So we were going to, at the end of the last meeting, Javi and I were going to coordinate over the summer to get the final revisions in. And for various reasons, that didn't happen. So this is not the most complete version. I know you think it is, but unfortunately
Most
it's
complete
not.
version, maybe I have.
You have, that everybody here has, but we missed a step.
Okay.
Probably unbeknownst to you, but we missed a step, for personal reasons over the summer. So, I'm happy to, I gave Rachel all of my notes so that she has all my scribbles and my edits and things that needed to be changed. I'm happy to go over it with Javi, Rachel, whatever, so that you can bring it back to the next meeting, which is good because it's 10:30, whatever. So, if the committee is okay with that.
I think there's no reason, I mean, I'm sure the committee agrees with us, there's no reason to redo work that's been done or take
Sure.
guess. We may as well confer, it was all discussed publicly already, and bring back a draft that's more thorough, if that.
Yes, everything that
reflects
Javi and I
everything
need
that's
to,
discussed.
yes, everything Javi and I need to go over was, everything was already, it was discussed, there's nothing new there. It's just whatever was discussed in the last public meeting. Because the NISBA template is so extensive and we were scratching out, moving things, it got a little confusing.
Well, and
So,
ours,
If you see my notes, you'll
our
see that.
policy started very small
Yeah.
too, so we're really significantly expanding this.
Yes, and I will add, there was a further revision to the open meetings law after NISBA put out this latest template. And so I would suggest that once we clean this up, maybe give it to Mr. Miller to make sure that whatever the latest revision was, which NISBA may have updated yet, I'm not sure, because I haven't checked, that we just make sure that when we finally do approve this thing, it's really as up to date and current as it can possibly be.
That sounds good. I think that we would probably get all of that done before October. If that's okay.
I think that'd be great if we
Shields, and
can,
we'll
yeah.
just add it because, I'll put my head together with Ms. Brooks and make sure that we get all the revisions in and then send it to you. And you can forward it to Mr. Miller and we can make sure everything's in there.
Thank you.
Okay, so back on in October. On my list, the next one I have is the transportation policy, 3414. And I believe this is on our list at the request, I'm assuming the reason this is on our list is at the request of board members and some of the product of some of the hot discussions about Salem and how we calculate the distance for purposes of providing transportation. I have some information, but I think you probably have some information too. Do you want to start?
Sure, I'll start. The question was raised of how do we calculate the distance to the front of the school, where is it from? Because some people have this belief that it's as the bird flies, but it's really as the car drives, or in our case, the bus drives, from the front of the property of the dwelling of the student to the front door of the school. So it's not to the nearest property crossing from the home of the school property, which was brought out in the conversation around Salem, because a number of the people on the back side of the Salem property, where there happens to be an open gate, also get buses. And there is some surprise about that, but it's really about how you drive from the front of the house to realistically drop off at the front door of the building. So the question was raised is, should we put that type of language in the policy? The distances are very specific in the policy, but how the transportation office calculates those distances is not it. Did you want to expand upon that?
Well, I think that the piece that's in front of the committee is really, should we change the language so that there's clarity when somebody's just reading the policy? I'm personally, as a philosophical perspective on policy, always in favor of making it as clear as possible, as long as the language isn't hemming us in, or creating restrictions for ourselves. But Dr. Shields, do you have an opinion on that? I mean, is there a reason that we wouldn't want to clarify this? I know a lot of this is governed by New York SED regulation and state law. We're obligated to provide transportation within certain distances. We actually provide transportation at much shorter distances than what state law requires. I believe it's for elementary school students, it's 2 miles under state law, and for secondary students, it's 3 miles. So the distances our grandparents walked in the snow are where we need to provide busing, but we provide it at, it's half a mile, I think, right?
Half a
For the-
mile K5, it's 3/4 of a mile 6 through 8, and it's 1.25 9 through 12.
So we're already providing more busing.
Right.
I guess from the Salem perspective, that issue is maybe quieted down a little bit. So we should be looking at this from an ongoing policy perspective. I mean, does anybody have any objection to adding some language about how it's calculated?
Kathy, I would ask you, since you oversee transportation and they calculate these routes regularly, and we want to give them that flexibility, do you see that would be helpful to put in that specific language?
I think so, but we actually use transponder to tell us the distance. Some parents could go on Google Maps and they say, well, according to Google Maps, it is, so I think we have to speak with legal also to see what specific wording to use and what.
I think that's a really
Because transponder might not exist in 5 years or 10 years, so we want to have
How
some.
are they different? How did the calculation change?
I couldn't really tell you why Google Maps doesn't match transponder. That's something I would have to look into. But transponder has all the digital maps. That's what we just did a whole upgrade for, so that we can eventually have an app for the parents to see. So I would have to look into why transponder is different, but maybe it could be wording that whatever software the district uses to calculate the bus routes is what should be followed. That's the determination, not Google or Earth Maps or some other things. That could be rounding issues or things like that, so.
What are your thoughts about maybe the process of how we determine this? It lives on the website under the transportation tab as opposed to the policy. Because I'm looking at the website right now, that's probably Robin calling. So it gives them, an overview of the mileage, clearly where the department is, all that stuff. If we maybe make something very specific geared toward how that's determined, maybe it lives there, and then it's easy access to, instead of then going to a board policy, you can find it on the website.
But also I think your transportation policies are silent to little buses and different issues like that. Like with private school, lead buses. I don't think our policy speaks to that. And a lot of school districts have policies that speak to lead buses being provided.
It's interesting that you should raise that, because a lot of this is governed by state law, right? It's not that we have the right to decide this, right? But we can set, just as we have set policy that we will provide busing at shorter distances than required by state law, we also can set policy about late buses and things like that.
When they'll be provided, because whatever you're providing for your students who come to our schools hasn't already provided for your parental place. So if we would provide a late bus where there's more than 5 children on that bus, we would provide it. But you could have children placed parentally where there's only 1 child, and the district isn't required to provide late transportation for that. And that's the
Would it
ultimate
be helpful to, do you think, you and the transportation office to have those
question. Yes.
discussed as policy and be in writing?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, I think the goal there would be to eliminate some of the uncertainties so that you're not dealing with upset parents. I mean,
I think informed parents also won't be upset. They'll say, okay, I understand that.
Mhm.
And then we have somewhere to actually reference that this is the board's policy. It wasn't just an arbitrary decision.
Right.
So I can work
we can
with the
also,
transportation direction, but
to add some things. I mean, I think, to my mind, when we are creating that kind of policy, we also want to make it very clear that we follow
the
state
guidelines,
law
yeah.
X, right?
Yes.
And the certainty that we provide for parents can be directing them to where to look and then have a summary form of what the details look like. Because I know I read this through all recently because I had a sense of what the rule was, but I wanted to read the detail on the rule. But parents shouldn't have to go to that much work. And you're right, there are very clear rules on what we're obligated to provide both for our students who are educated here and the students who are enrolled in a private school.
Also for special needs students and
Right, placements that we've
sometimes
made.
parents don't realize we could be providing services for somebody who lives within a half mile of the district. But we can't disclose that to people because there's criminal privacy.
Okay, so, I wanna add one other thing here, and then a question for you, Dr. Shields. So just from, my printer printed unreasonably small for some reason, but, New York SED, just for the committee and to have in our mind as reference, this is from New York SED. Measurements for determining eligibility for transportation must be made over the nearest available shortest route between the home and the school, which is what you said, as roads. Measurements may be made over private roads with the landowner's consent and over publicly maintained pathways. Which means we really could measure another way. But importantly, school districts have broad discretion in selecting measurement points on school property for purposes of determining eligibility. District officials may measure from any point on school property as long as they do so fairly and consistently. The Commissioner of Education has held that a school district is not required to expend a great deal of time, effort, and money in measuring distances, nor is it required to measure with the accuracy of a professional survey. It's well settled that the use of calibrated automobile odometer is legally reasonable and sufficient, and calibration can be as simple as comparing odometer readings with the mileage markers along a highway. I think as we're considering what to put in this, we should keep this in mind because this is a point where we could make a policy that creates a real administrative hassle where there doesn't need to be one. But perhaps we could incorporate some of this language when we're explaining how these measurements are done so that people understand that this isn't something to make a lot out of. If that makes sense to
Yes, but some
everybody.
schools go as far as saying the flagpole at the elementary school is where we measure from, or the front door at the elementary school, or so they do give a specific spot in their policies.
Okay.
Yes.
Dr. Shields, for this policy, as we're really adding a great deal, what do you think the procedure should look like for this? And who drafts, right? Do we want to gather information from the parties and then discuss here again next time? Do we want to try and put together a draft for next time? What do you think?
Sure, what I heard Kathy saying is that she would like to look at this with Robin Allen, the Director of Transportation, and recommend any upgrades to it.
Yes. And in additional policies, you know, there could be like 3 or 4 other policies in addition to that would be helpful.
Okay.
So I'll look at that and look at certain districts.
That's great. So you're fine with bringing us
Oh,
drafts?
yes.
That's great.
So I want to make a recommendation, and this is, Mr. Howard, something that you said, I'm just going to echo that I thought it was a really good idea. I think that we need a source of truth on this, and the source of truth is the vendor that we use, so it's transponder rather than Google, and I think just including that in the policy. And it shouldn't be transponder, it should be like the policy should say the vendor selected by the board, as we move on, so that you know, people that go into Google, and there's gonna be people who live on a border, right? That 2 houses down is in and 2 houses down is out, and Google says something different than our vendor, we have to just clarify, like, it's not Google, it's our vendor.
I agree with that. Can we make the language even more broad? Since now we've seen, you know, going back to policies that require something be done by fax, right? Maybe the language is something about, you know, the school district will select a method of measurement that is used to measure for every student, you know, something like that, that makes sure that it's being done. Like, we're putting a policy that's being done fairly and consistently by the method of the school's choice, which is legally fine.
That's fine.
I'll put it together and we could critique it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Brooks?
Yeah, can I suggest that somebody on the policy committee look into the NISPA templates? Because this version from 1996 doesn't have any reference to state law. And we like to put the state law reference as a cross-reference, so any really interested parents who want to nerd out on the law can understand why whatever we're doing is not arbitrary, whether it's state transportation law, state education law, or commissioner's regulations, whatever it is. NISPA should have something updated on this, and surrounding districts may have something as well. And I'm thanking you, Ms. O'Hara, for including the out-of-district students who are staying late at school, whether they have, you know, basketball or whatever activities, and if it's less than the threshold number of students, I think that there's certainly a budgetary implication to sending a bus to pick up one student and shuttle them back and forth. And if there's a legal basis for the school district not to do that, I think that that should be included in the policy.
Ms. Brooks, you were talking about the law, under C, it mentions section 3621, article 2 of the education law, is that what you're looking for?
So if that's still the law, if that's still where the law lives, then yeah, but that should be referenced
At the bottom.
at the bottom as a cross-reference. You know, the laws have changed, and even the state legislatures remember their laws, repealed laws, enacted new laws, so I don't know what the current law is, but certainly our legal counsel should, NISPA, I'm sure, has been keeping track of that.
Yeah,
There's an updated version of this.
there's no reason to not, I think your suggestion is there's no reason to not look at NISPA and look at the template when they've already done all this work. They're
Yes.
already saying we should include the reference to the law, we might as well go look and see what their
Yes.
recommendation is, even if we don't accept it whole law.
Yes,
And the legal, under C, what is legally outlined is still state law, because I just looked it up, but I don't know if the number's correct. I don't remember.
yeah, and there may be other regulations
more.
and statutes that tie in and it's just cross-reference, so it's always good
Right.
to have that.
Thank you.
So the only item left on the agenda, I think, is a bit more of an extensive conversation, so I would suggest that we move that off to next month. And that was just a question that was raised, you know, do we want to have a DEI policy? And, you know, what steps do we want to take to explore the answer to that question? But we don't have to solve the answer to that question.
That's fine. So we want to just move it to October?
Yes.
And I know we're not slowing anything down, because of course the DEI work has been an ongoing effort and will be ongoing between now and October anyway. So that's everything on our agenda. We talked about as a committee, just adding sort of a new business section where we raise some other things or add anything to our agenda that we want to add, and then we'll open up for community comments. The only thing on my end is that at the budget committee, the idea was raised of looking at the various budget policies that we have in place, because many of them haven't been updated for a long time. But I think many of them may not have been updated because there are no updates. And many of them were legally required to be looking at. I know nobody's prepared to have the discussion today. Can we add that to our agenda for one of the coming months? And it may be that we just look at them and think they're fine and move on, but there's no reason not to do it. Is everybody okay with that? And Dr. Shields, what do you think about timing on that? When would be a good time to do that?
Well, it sounds like I think October is getting full as a result of this meeting. So maybe we can look at November or December.
It's fine with me, it's fine. I don't think there's no fire there.
Okay.
We can move the foreign policies to further away.
And just for budget seasons.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Any comments from the committee members or Dr. Shields, anything else that we need to know from you?
No.
Okay. Do you mind if I open it back up to community comments quickly and then we move on? Yes, Ms. Mawani.
Thank you. With respect, so I actually had a couple of comments also on public participation in board meetings and DEI, which I can either hold or sort of frame as questions. But first on the transportation policy and all policies in general, to Ms. Brooks's point, where our policies reference state regulations or mandates, or even in some cases federal documentation, now that we have this beautiful new interactive user-friendly website, would it be possible to actually link over to those for parents like me who do like to nerd out and go directly to source material? I've found in the past that it can be really difficult to find what you're actually looking for when you go into state documentation. So that would be wonderful and a benefit to the community. With respect to public participation at board meetings, I just had a question of whether the sort of complete version of it is to include language that is featured in the NISPA sample policy around the board having the ability in certain scenarios to respond in the moment to the community, to correct inaccurate information, or there was one other circumstance in which it gave the board flexibility to interact. So I think that if it didn't include that, might help address some frustration in the community about having to sort of get up and shout into the void, and would also stop the flow of misinformation, because as we all know, just because you say something out loud doesn't always make it true. So I personally feel that giving the board that flexibility in policy signals something important to the community.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, and I know I'm not the chair, but since this was started under,
Jump right in.
that thing, and I'm too familiar with it, which paragraph in the NISPA template, to which paragraph are you referring? Because we deleted a lot of what was in the template.
Yeah.
And so if you're, and I just don't know exactly where it is on the template.
So it's
Where, is it says.
it's actually
how to-
underlined, and it said it's where,
Should not expect to engage in discussion with the board,
Right.
while the board may correct comments.
Yes.
That one.
that
So
is
that's
not,
on page 3 of the NISBA template, and it's the 1, 2. It's the last line of the third non-shaded paragraph down. We actually deleted that. And actually I have that this was Dr. Block's comment, and it said that we would do our best to address questions under old business. That's how we left that. So I don't know if, I know exactly what you're talking about, Ms. Malwani. I don't know if the committee wants to revisit that language, but the old committee last year had decided to take out that last line. And we had decided that we just were not going to engage with the public, but now you're asking this committee to
revise it, so I'm gonna be quiet now just because I gave you the history and I will not.
Especially if it's going to be done by exception, like if the board is going to, or members of the board will chime in and say, well, actually, we can respond to a question, or we can correct that inaccuracy. If the board does not intend to do any of those things, I think that's a different story, and the board does not intend to interact with the public in any way. But if there is sort of a possibility that that will happen by exception, I personally, and on behalf of the community, think that it would be helpful to include language that gives the board some flexibility.
It's an interesting question. I mean, personally, my bias would always be towards actually saying something. As a board member, it's frustrating to sit there and hear something that is incorrect or misunderstanding something and not say something and say, we'll wait till a month from now to say something about this. I know when generally our policies on comments from the public, there's always a constitutional issue underlying our policies because we can't make content-based restrictions and we want to look like we're making content-based restrictions, and the way to make it most clear is to always be consistent and exactly the same in how we handle questions. I don't think there's that same implication in answering that. I have a guess that historically what happened then was, okay, well, we're consistent on this. We should also be consistent on whether we respond to people, because members of the public will perceive it badly if we respond to some but not to others. But this distinction about correcting information is interesting rather than engaging in discussion, right? Because I think there's probably also a civility measure here, but we've all been at meetings where exceptions were made, right? We've been at meetings where Dr. Hines jumped in to comment because it was something that could be fixed in that moment or addressed in that moment, and why let it wait? What does the rest of the community think about this?
Well, to, Jessica, the edited version that we didn't go into depth about today, because as Ms. Brooks said, she's got some work to do with Hobby. She does have that line, commenters should not expect to engage in discussion with the board, however, the board will answer questions at the next board meeting under old business. So I think that addresses a little bit of it, but to your other point, correcting misinformation, I don't know what, I think it's an important thing that we should address.
It's specifically correcting inaccuracies where policy exists, so it's based in fact. I think that's a very specific scenario that maybe worth articulating.
So maybe, since we're short on time and we are discussing this again next time, I'm gonna put it down that this is a discussion point that we'll just explicitly talk about and hear from the administration, and the committee will discuss the next meeting.
Thank you. And finally, on the DEI, I just wanted to confirm that the first document that was presented is a district document, and it's the attachments that follow our NISTA sample regulations.
Just one moment. So the first document, let me see what it is for our first document.
3431.
3431,
Yes.
105, it says in the upper right
Yeah.
corner. That is a Jericho policy?
Okay.
We don't have this policy at all
Yeah,
currently.
we don't have a policy. But I
So,
wanted to know where that came from.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Good. So my point on that is moved
Oh,
to some further discussion.
Yes.
I think that lack of a policy is the reason that we think that we definitely have to have this conversation about what policy should look like, because neighboring districts do have one at this point. Are you okay with one last community comment?
Well, I just want to say, in response, I have 2 points. I think the board, at its discretion, can respond to issues of the superintendent that are totally wrong, and don't further engage into any discussion. And if the public wants to do so, then they can, take it to an email or a meeting or whatever. But I think that when someone gets out there, I can hear some things like that. I think that it is incumbent upon the board that, well, with due respect, that's not true according to the science or whatever. So I do agree with that, because it has been, how many years I have been in this coming board to the board meetings, that sometimes the public, and we have quite a few friends who feel that there is like a bias. And some people are responded to directly, especially under the old board, not this one, which is so beautiful. But they would just select those who, I can tell you that there were many members of the community who were very angry and resentful about it. Like everything else, I always use my expression desperate. People are desperate, but they keep quiet. So I just want to say that. With respect to public speaking, I basically understand the intent of the policy. But you have to be careful, because who decides what is complaint or what is defamatory? I mean, some things are, like the famous Supreme Court justice said, right? When they see pornography, not what it is. Because it could be that there is a capricious board that says, no, you cannot say this, or you can. And actually, at the beginning of the summer, and I'll finish with this, the district court, I believe in Texas and New Mexico, found that the board had created its own policies because of giving all these bumps for liberty and all these things that are going on. They didn't want to hear it, and they didn't want to hear complaints of the board. So that federal district court found that the board could not do that, even if they felt that it was criticizing them, and I think it was upheld by the 11th appellate jurisdiction, which would apply to New York too. So, I mean, like Ms. Brooks said, there are things that the law is evolving constantly. And that might be something, maybe Mr. Miller should look into that. But I understand the intent, because you don't want to have people there, saying things that are plain defamatory or insulting to other people. So I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you. With that, I think we are done. Thank you for staying a little longer. And we have a robust agenda for next month, feels like next month. Thank you.
Well, thank you. We'll be back here again on the 19th.
All right. See everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
We should. You have it?